Alex Hogan is tracking all the tension. Alex, what's the latest on the ground?
Hi, Brian. The IDF spokesperson speaking directly to the Iranian regime, saying that they should be prepared, that Israel will continue to carry out actions in Iran, saying, quote, the way to Tehran is paved, speaking to the abilities of the Israeli Air Force to go deep into Iran and hit as many as 150 targets. Israel also releasing this footage of the IDF taking out drones as part of the barrages of Iranian drones and missiles that we've seen in the last day. While Israel managed to shoot down Iran's 100 drones yesterday, some missiles made it past the country's air defense systems. This was the night sky here in the city of Tel Aviv, a scene repeated with Iran's multiple waves of attacks from dusk all the way until dawn. Explosions also rocking Jerusalem. Iran fired more than 200 missiles toward Israel, projectiles that lit up the night sky with Israel's air defense systems, aiming to intercept them with the support of U.S. forces. 3 people are dead and 70 are reported wounded, including 7 Israeli soldiers. Now, footage from some of the latest victims here that you can see who are displaced early this morning after strikes that were launched at dawn. Medics helping take people away in wheelchairs, displaced families, kids, people holding pets and rolling suitcases with all of their belongings. Israel early this morning continued to target military sites in Iran. Smoke was seen rising at the Meredith International Airport in Tehran. And a senior Israeli intelligence official telling Fox News today that 40 Iranian air defense systems were hit since the beginning of the operation, and at least 20 commanders were killed. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, accusing Israel of starting a war. Israel's defense minister firing back, saying, quote, if Khamenei continues to fire missiles at Israel's home front, Tehran will burn. One of the sites targeted in Israel's Operation Rising Lion was the Natanz nuclear site, Iran's main enrichment facility. That is where Iran was producing uranium enriched up to 60%. The Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency announced that the above-ground part of this plant that you see above ground, the electricity infrastructure, the emergency power supply, and the backup generators have all been destroyed. The Director General Rafael Grossi also going on to say that as far as the radiological levels outside of that plant, they are still at a normal level, meaning that as of right now, there's no indication of harm to the people who live in that area. Brian.
And Alex, President Trump is saying that he is hopeful that this attack by Israel will bring Iran back to the negotiating table. What more can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. That's the comment that we heard the president give to Axios yesterday before he was in the Situation Room. We were expecting to see a 6th round of negotiations take place this weekend. Iran says it's not going to participate in that. Now, the foreign minister saying that any further talks at this point simply would be unjustifiable. Brian.
Alex Hogan, thank you for your terrific reporting from Tel Aviv. Please stay safe. U.S. officials confirming our military assisted in shooting down Iranian missiles fired at Israel. Mark Meredith is at the White House with more on the Trump administration's response. Mark.
Brian, good morning to you. We've yet to hear from President Trump on camera about this escalating attacks between Israel and Iran. Obviously, the White House closely monitoring the situation, and U.S. officials confirming that they are assisting Israel in its defense from these Iranian attacks. But the administration also keeping out hope that there's a possibility that both sides could de-escalate the situation, while at the same time getting Iran to completely abandon its nuclear program. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth spoke to Fox within the last hour. He said the U.S. remains in a good posture when it comes to its resources in the area, and that they believe that they have the assets they need to get the job done in terms of protecting American personnel stationed overseas. The Wall Street Journal had a chance to speak with President Trump as he spoke to many outlets on Friday by phone. The Journal asked him how much of a heads up the president had about all this. This is what he told them. He said, heads up, it wasn't a heads up. I knew it was going on. What was going on? The president says he has repeatedly urged Iran to make a deal. Iran's top diplomat says talks with the U.S., though, are, quote, unjustifiable given the events of the last 48 hours. Up on Capitol Hill, lawmakers are watching these developments, too. Top Democrats agreeing with the White House that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, but some are also calling for restraint. Republicans tell Fox Iran has long posed a threat to the U.S. and its allies.
remember, it's not just a threat to Israel or our friends in the region. It's a threat to the United States. They don't just chant death to Israel, they chant death to America, and they're working on missiles that can hit us here in America.
We know that the president has been working the phone, speaking not only to reporters, but his U.S. allies, including the head of Israel, regarding the situation. We have yet, though, to hear from the president on camera today. We've got that big military parade, Brian, so we'll look to see if the president says anything as he attends the festivities. Brian.
Mark Meredith live at the White House. Mark, thank you. With more now on the continuing attacks, Brent Sadler, a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation and retired U.S. Navy captain. Brent, thank you so much for being here. A lot to discuss. Israel has damaged Iran's nuclear capability. To what extent, we're not entirely sure quite yet. If Israel does not, I guess the way to say this is, would it be a failure, this mission, a failure, if they do not completely eliminate Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. And again, happy birthday to the Army. They turned 250 today. And the question is an important one, and it was always going to be very risky on Israel or anyone else to try to take out Iran's nuclear enterprise, their weapons program. And the only way that there's any surety that you got everything is getting access to the documents and as well as all the sites to prove that you've destroyed it or degraded it completely. So we're never going to get a satisfactory answer until we've got that boots on the ground, inspector boots that is, inside Iran to verify that everything has been destroyed. If it's not, then it's just a question about how long till Iran reconstitutes. And the question of success or failure is something that's going to be judged either in months or years, depending on what type of Iran or Iranian regime comes out the other side of this conflict.
Brent, what should the United States do now in terms of helping Israel? We obviously, the president, based on the president's comments, we were aware of these attacks. We gave the green light. We've helped him in the defense from these ballistic missile attacks. What should the United States do next? Should they provide the bunker buster weaponry needed to completely eliminate the nuclear capabilities of Iran? Should we take a next step if they're not willing to come to the negotiating table, which as of now doesn't seem like they are?
So just to restate, I think the course that's been laid out and what the president has restated numerous times is the preference and what is in America's best interest is not to get directly involved in a conflict with Iran, but at the same time, this regime must not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon to include any level of processing or refinement of uranium. So that is the objective. If it requires putting on the table for Israel to get more capable weapon systems, I think that is something that should be done. I'm not sure that's necessary for success. But again, the longer that the regime in Tehran decides to take a very belligerent posture and not enter into negotiations to end that nuclear program of theirs, I think the pressure will have to go up. I think the Israelis are prepared to do that, especially coming in the coming days if Iran doesn't show up on Sunday for the 6th round of talks.
So the risk here obviously is further escalation. So what do you think Iran does next? We've seen reports of Iranian lawmakers talking about threatening shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, which would affect the economy, not quite as much as it would have years ago. Our dependence on oil is less, but nonetheless, do you expect Iran to shut down the Strait of Hormuz? Do you expect them, or if not, what else do you expect them to do?
Yeah, so first on the Strait of Hormuz, in years past, the Iranians used that for, as blackmail. They would threaten the United States of shutting or cutting off the oil flow through the Straits of Hormuz. That doesn't really bother us as much as it does our allies in Europe and in Northeast Asia. So it's not a direct American, I guess, concern, as so to speak. So the leverage that the Iranian regime has is lesser there. What really is a concern, I think, on what could come next from the Iranians if they so choose to escalate, is they might activate their sleeper cells, their terrorist allies around the world or in the United States through years of open borders to hurt the United States directly or to go after Israeli interest here and or abroad. I think that is highly likely, though would be extremely escalatory and is one of the circumstances that the president also kind of insinuated would trigger an American response. So other than the ballistic missiles, that's really the only other option the Iranians have.
It sounds like you think escalation is likely here, not de-escalation, at least in the short term, based on what you were just telling us, Brent.
Yes.
That's correct? Yes. Okay. Brent Sadler, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.